Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that might surprise you. We're diving into the world of medieval entertainment, leisure, and fun. And let me tell you, when medieval people weren't working themselves to the bone or dying from the plague, they found some truly bizarre ways to enjoy themselves. From violent sports that would make modern football look tame, to drinking games that could kill you, from festivals where chaos reigned to entertainment so strange, you won't believe it was real. Medieval fun was wild, dangerous, and absolutely fascinating. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, adjust your pillow, and let the world slow down around you. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with a fundamental question. Did medieval people even have free time? The answer is more complicated than you might think. For the vast majority of the population, peasants who made up roughly 80 to 90% of medieval society, life was dominated by work. Backbreaking, dawn to dusk, survival-dependent work. But here's the thing. Medieval people actually had more days off than most modern workers. The medieval calendar was packed with holy days, feast days, and religious festivals. Some historians estimate that medieval peasants had between 100 and 150 days off per year. That's more vacation time than most Americans get today. Of course, these weren't paid vacation days. They were religious observances, and you were expected to attend church services, participate in community rituals, and honor the saints. But after the religious obligations were fulfilled, the rest of the day was yours. And medieval people used that time to play, to celebrate, to drink, and to engage in activities that would shock modern sensibilities. The concept of leisure in the Middle Ages was different from our modern understanding. There was no clear separation between work and play, between sacred and profane, between community obligation and personal enjoyment. Everything was interconnected, woven into the fabric of daily life. For nobles, leisure was a different matter entirely. The aristocracy didn't work in the way peasants did. Their days were filled with activities that we might consider leisure: hunting, hawking, tournaments, feasting. But these weren't just hobbies. They were displays of status, training for war, and ways of maintaining social hierarchies. A noble who spent his days hunting wasn't just having fun. He was demonstrating his wealth, his power, his right to rule. He was practicing skills that would be useful in battle. He was reinforcing his position at the top of the social order. Leisure for nobles was never just leisure. It was always political. But even nobles had moments of pure enjoyment, times when they could set aside the weight of their responsibilities and simply play. They played board games, listened to music, watched performances, and engaged in elaborate courtly rituals that were part game, part social performance. The church had complicated feelings about leisure. On one hand, the church recognized that people needed rest, that constant work was unhealthy, that celebration was part of human nature. The church calendar was designed to provide regular breaks from labor, to give people time to worship and to enjoy God's creation. On the other hand, the church was deeply suspicious of many forms of entertainment: dancing, drinking, gambling, sexual activity. All of these were potential sources of sin. The church constantly warned against excessive pleasure, against activities that might lead people away from God and toward damnation. This tension between the need for leisure and the fear of sin shaped medieval entertainment. Many activities existed in a gray area, tolerated but not approved, enjoyed but also condemned. Medieval people learned to navigate this tension, to find ways to have fun while staying within the bounds of acceptable behavior, or at least not getting caught when they crossed those bounds. The rhythm of medieval life was dictated by the seasons and the agricultural calendar. Winter was a time of relative rest, when there was less work to be done in the fields. This was when many festivals and celebrations took place, when people had time to gather, to tell stories, to play games. Spring and summer were busier, with planting and tending crops. But even during these busy seasons, there were breaks. Sundays were always days of rest, at least in theory. And the numerous feast days provided regular interruptions to the work routine. Harvest time was both the busiest and the most celebratory period. The work was intense, with everyone laboring to bring in the crops before bad weather struck. But once the harvest was complete, there would be a great celebration, a harvest festival where the community would feast, drink, and give thanks for the year's bounty. These seasonal rhythms created a pattern of work and rest, of labor and celebration that structured medieval life. People didn't have leisure time in the modern sense, with evenings and weekends free. Instead, they had intense periods of work punctuated by days or even weeks of celebration. The concept of childhood leisure was also different. Children were expected to work from a young age, helping with household tasks, tending animals, learning trades. But they also played, creating games from whatever materials were at hand, running through fields, swimming in streams, getting into mischief. Medieval children didn't have toys in the modern sense. They had simple objects, sticks, stones, scraps of cloth, carved wooden figures. But they had imagination, and they created elaborate games and stories from these simple materials. Their play was often a miniature version of adult life, preparing them for the roles they would eventually assume. For adults, leisure was often communal. People didn't entertain themselves in isolation. They gathered in groups, in taverns, in village squares, in great halls. Entertainment was a social activity, a way of building and maintaining community bonds. This communal nature of medieval leisure is one of the biggest differences from modern entertainment. We're used to individual consumption, watching TV alone, scrolling through our phones, listening to music with headphones. Medieval people experienced entertainment together, as a community, with all the social dynamics that entailed. The lack of artificial light also shaped medieval leisure. Once the sun set, activities were limited. You could gather around a fire, tell stories, sing songs. But most activities required daylight. This meant that leisure time was concentrated during the day, during those precious hours when work was suspended and the sun was still up. So yes, medieval people had leisure time. They had opportunities for fun, for play, for celebration. But their leisure was different from ours, shaped by religion, by community, by the rhythms of agricultural life, and by a worldview that saw pleasure as both a gift from God and a potential path to sin. If there's one thing medieval people knew how to do, it was throw a festival. And these weren't polite, orderly affairs. Medieval festivals were chaotic, raucous, sometimes violent celebrations that turned the normal social order upside down. The medieval calendar was packed with festivals. There were the major Christian holidays, Christmas, Easter, Pentecost. There were saints' feast days, and with hundreds of saints in the medieval calendar, there was always something to celebrate. There were seasonal festivals marking the turning of the year, Mayday, Midsummer, harvest festivals. Each of these festivals had its own traditions, its own rituals, its own forms of entertainment, but they all shared certain characteristics. They were communal. They involved feasting and drinking. They often included elements of role reversal and social transgression, and they provided a release valve for the tensions and frustrations of daily life. Let's start with Christmas, which in the Middle Ages was very different from the holiday we know today. Medieval Christmas was a 12-day festival running from December 25th to January 6th. It was a time of feasting, drinking, and merrymaking that would make modern office parties look tame. The centerpiece of medieval Christmas was the feast. Lords would host elaborate banquets for their households and tenants, with multiple courses of meat, fish, pies, and sweets. The goal was abundance, excess, a temporary suspension of the usual scarcity. People ate until they were stuffed, drank until they were drunk, and celebrated until they collapsed. But medieval Christmas also had a darker, stranger side. There was the tradition of the Lord of Misrule, a commoner who would be chosen to preside over the Christmas festivities. For the duration of the festival, this person would have authority, could give orders, could mock the nobility. It was a temporary inversion of the social hierarchy, a safety valve that allowed people to express resentment and frustration in a controlled way. There were also mumming plays, performances where people would dress in costumes and masks and act out traditional stories. These plays often involved cross-dressing, with men playing women and women playing men. They included bawdy humor, sexual innuendo, and mockery of authority figures. For a brief time, the normal rules didn't apply. Easter was another major festival, but it had a different character. Easter was about renewal, rebirth, the triumph of life over death. The celebrations were more religious, more solemn, but they still included feasting, games, and entertainment. One popular Easter tradition was egg rolling, where decorated eggs would be rolled down hills. This was both a game and a symbolic act, representing the rolling away of the stone from Christ's tomb. Children would compete to see whose egg could roll the furthest without breaking. There were also Easter plays, dramatic reenactments of the crucifixion and resurrection. These could be elaborate productions, with multiple actors, costumes, and special effects. They were both religious instruction and entertainment, teaching biblical stories to a largely illiterate population while also providing spectacle and drama. Mayday was a celebration of spring, of fertility, of the return of warmth and life after the long winter. It was one of the most joyous and also one of the most controversial festivals in the medieval calendar. The centerpiece of Mayday was the Maypole, a tall pole decorated with ribbons and flowers. Young people would dance around the Maypole, weaving the ribbons into intricate patterns. This was a courtship ritual, a way for young men and women to interact, to flirt, to choose partners. But Mayday also had a reputation for sexual license. Young people would go into the woods on May Eve, ostensibly to gather flowers and greenery to decorate the village. But everyone knew that more than flowers were being gathered. Mayday was a time when the normal rules of sexual behavior were relaxed, when young people could experiment, when pregnancies that resulted were quietly accepted. The church was deeply ambivalent about Mayday. On one hand, it was a celebration of God's creation, of the beauty and abundance of nature. On the other hand, it was associated with pagan traditions, with sexual immorality, with behavior that the church officially condemned. But the church couldn't suppress Mayday. It was too popular, too deeply rooted in folk tradition. Midsummer, the summer solstice, was another major festival. It was celebrated with bonfires, dancing, and all-night revelry. People believed that midsummer was a magical time, when the boundary between the human world and the fairy world was thin, when strange things could happen. Young people would jump over the bonfires, a ritual that was supposed to bring good luck and fertility. Couples would hold hands and leap together, and if they made it across without letting go, it was a sign that their relationship would last. It was dangerous, with burns and injuries common, but that was part of the thrill. Harvest festivals were times of thanksgiving and relief. The hard work of bringing in the crops was done, and the community could relax and celebrate. These festivals involved feasting on the newly harvested grain, drinking the new ale, and giving thanks to God for providing. But harvest festivals also had a competitive element. There would be contests to see who could reap the fastest, who could bind the most sheaves, who could thresh the most grain. These contests were both practical, getting the work done, and entertaining, providing a way to show off skill and strength. One particularly strange harvest tradition was the corn dolly, a figure woven from the last sheaf of grain. This dolly was believed to contain the spirit of the harvest, and it would be kept in the house over the winter to ensure good luck and a successful crop the next year. It was a blend of Christian and pagan beliefs, a folk tradition that the church tolerated but didn't officially endorse. Carnival, the period before Lent, was perhaps the wildest of all medieval festivals. Knowing that they would soon have to give up meat, alcohol, and other pleasures for the 40 days of Lent, people went all out during Carnival. It was a time of excess, of indulgence, of doing everything that would soon be forbidden. Carnival celebrations included elaborate parades with people dressed in costumes and masks. There was music, dancing, street performances. There was also a lot of drinking, a lot of eating, and a lot of sexual activity. Carnival was a time when the normal rules were suspended, when people could behave in ways that would be scandalous at any other time of year. The most famous carnival tradition was the election of a mock king or queen, someone who would rule over the festivities. This person would be dressed in ridiculous clothing, would be paraded through the streets, would be both honored and mocked. It was another example of the medieval love of role reversal, of temporarily turning the social order upside down. All of these festivals served important social functions. They provided entertainment and relief from the hardships of daily life. They reinforced community bonds, bringing people together in shared celebration. They allowed for the expression of emotions and desires that were normally suppressed. And they provided a safety valve, a controlled way to release social tensions before they exploded into violence or rebellion. Medieval festivals were not just fun. They were essential to the functioning of medieval society, a way of maintaining social cohesion while also allowing for moments of transgression and release. If you wanted to have fun in medieval times, chances are you'd end up in a tavern. These establishments were the social centers of medieval life, places where people gathered to drink, to talk, to play games, to hear news, and to escape the drudgery of daily existence. Taverns existed in every town and most villages. They ranged from simple alehouses, basically someone's home where they brewed and sold ale, to more elaborate establishments with multiple rooms, entertainment, and food. But they all served the same basic function, providing a place where people could drink and socialize. The primary beverage in medieval taverns was ale. This wasn't the clear, filtered beer we drink today. Medieval ale was thick, cloudy, and often had bits of grain floating in it. It was brewed without hops, which meant it didn't keep well and had to be consumed quickly. It was also relatively weak, with an alcohol content of around 2 to 3%. People drank ale because water was often unsafe. Rivers and wells were contaminated with waste, and drinking water could make you sick. Ale, because it was boiled during the brewing process, was safer, so people drank ale all day, every day. Children drank it, adults drank it, even monks and nuns drank it. But tavern ale was different from the ale people drank at home. The tavern ale was often stronger, and it was consumed in larger quantities. Going to the tavern wasn't just about quenching your thirst. It was about getting drunk, about loosening up, about forgetting your troubles for a few hours. Wine was also available in taverns, but it was more expensive and generally consumed by wealthier patrons. Wine was imported from France, Spain, and Italy, and it was a status symbol. A merchant or minor noble might drink wine to show off his wealth, while peasants stuck to ale. Taverns were rowdy places. They were loud, smoky, and often violent. Arguments would break out over dice games, over insults, over women. Fights were common, and they could turn deadly. Many taverns had weapons hanging on the walls, not for decoration, but because patrons had been required to check them at the door. But taverns were also places of community and connection. This was where you heard the news, where you learned what was happening in the wider world. Travelers would stop at taverns and share stories from distant places. Merchants would discuss business. Farmers would complain about the weather and the harvest. Taverns were also places of entertainment. There might be musicians playing, minstrels singing songs, storytellers spinning tales. Some taverns had dice games, card games, or board games. Others had more elaborate entertainment, like puppet shows or trained animals. Drinking games were popular in medieval taverns. One common game was I Love My Love with an A, where players would take turns saying phrases that started with successive letters of the alphabet. If you couldn't think of a phrase, you had to drink. Another game involved passing a cup around a circle with each person taking a drink and then making up a rule that everyone else had to follow. These games could get out of hand quickly. The goal was often to get as drunk as possible, and people would drink until they passed out, vomited, or started fights. Tavern keepers had to be skilled at managing drunk patrons, at diffusing conflicts before they turned violent, at knowing when to cut someone off. Women in taverns were a complicated subject. Female tavern keepers, called Alewives, were common. Brewing was often women's work, and many women ran successful tavern businesses. But women who drank in taverns, especially women who weren't the proprietor, were viewed with suspicion. A woman drinking in a tavern was assumed to be sexually available, a prostitute, or at least a woman of loose morals. This wasn't fair, but it was the reality. Respectable women generally didn't frequent taverns, at least not without male relatives to accompany them. Prostitution was indeed common in and around taverns. Some taverns were essentially brothels, with rooms upstairs where prostitutes would take their clients. Other taverns simply tolerated prostitutes working in their establishments, taking a cut of the profits. The church condemned taverns as dens of sin, places where people wasted their money, ruined their health, and endangered their souls. Priests would preach against the evils of drink, warning that taverns were gateways to hell, but these warnings had limited effect. People kept going to taverns, kept drinking, kept enjoying themselves despite the church's disapproval. Some taverns had reputations as particularly dangerous or disreputable. These were the places where criminals gathered, where stolen goods were fenced, where violence was expected. Smart people avoided these establishments, but they also added to the mystique and excitement of tavern culture. Other taverns were more respectable, catering to merchants, craftsmen, and minor nobles. These establishments might have better ale, cleaner facilities, and stricter rules about behavior. They were still rowdy, but they were less likely to end in bloodshed. The tavern signs were important because most people couldn't read. A tavern would have a distinctive sign hanging outside, often a picture of an animal, an object, or a symbol. The red lion, the white hart, the green dragon. These names and images helped people identify and remember taverns. The social dynamics of taverns were complex. There was a hierarchy, with regular patrons having more status than newcomers, with wealthier drinkers commanding more respect than poor ones. But there was also a leveling effect. In a tavern, a peasant could sit next to a merchant, could share a drink, could have a conversation that would never happen in other contexts. Taverns were also places where information was exchanged, where deals were made, where alliances were formed. A lot of medieval business was conducted in taverns, over cups of ale, with handshakes and verbal agreements. These informal contracts were often more binding than written documents, because they were witnessed by the community. The role of the tavern keeper was crucial. A good tavern keeper knew everyone, knew their business, knew how to keep the peace. They were part bartender, part mediator, part community leader. They extended credit to regular customers, settled disputes, and provided a space where the community could gather. Taverns were open late, often until midnight or later. This was one of the few places where people could socialize after dark, where they could extend their day beyond the limitations of natural light. Candles and oil lamps provided illumination, creating a warm, flickering atmosphere that was both inviting and slightly dangerous. The smell of a medieval tavern was distinctive: ale, smoke, sweat, and sometimes vomit. It wasn't pleasant by modern standards, but it was familiar, comforting even. It was the smell of community, of shared experience, of temporary escape from the hardships of medieval life. Taverns were essential to medieval social life. They provided entertainment, community, and a space where people could be themselves, could relax, could forget for a few hours that life was hard and often short. They were places of joy and sorrow, of friendship and violence, of connection and isolation. They were, in many ways, the heart of medieval fun. Music was everywhere in medieval life. It wasn't something you listened to through headphones or at concerts. It was woven into the fabric of daily existence, accompanying work, worship, and celebration. And when medieval people wanted to have fun, music and dancing were at the center of it. The medieval soundscape was very different from ours. There was no recorded music, no amplification, no electronic instruments. All music was live, performed by human voices and acoustic instruments. This meant that music was a communal activity, something you participated in rather than passively consumed. Singing was the most common form of music. People sang while they worked, rhythmic songs that helped coordinate labor and made the time pass more quickly. They sang in church, elaborate polyphonic hymns that filled cathedrals with sound. They sang at home, simple melodies passed down through generations. Work songs were particularly important. Farmers would sing while plowing, the rhythm helping them maintain a steady pace. Weavers would sing while working their looms. Sailors would sing sea shanties to coordinate their efforts. These songs were functional, but they were also a form of entertainment, a way to make hard work more bearable. Religious music was central to medieval life. The church was the primary patron of music, and much of the musical innovation of the period happened in religious contexts. Gregorian chant, with its haunting, otherworldly melodies, was the soundtrack of medieval worship. But religious music wasn't just for church. People sang hymns at home, taught them to their children, used them as lullabies and prayers. The line between sacred and secular music was blurry, with religious melodies often adapted for secular purposes and vice versa. Secular music was where things got really interesting. This was music for entertainment, for dancing, for celebration. It was performed by professional musicians called minstrels, troubadours, or jongleurs, depending on the region and time period. These musicians were wanderers, traveling from town to town, from castle to castle, performing for whoever would pay them. They were skilled in multiple instruments, could sing, could tell stories, could juggle and perform acrobatics. They were entertainers in the fullest sense, providing a complete show. The instruments of medieval music were diverse. There were string instruments like the lute, the harp, and the viol, an early form of the violin. There were wind instruments like the recorder, the shawm, and the bagpipes. There were percussion instruments like drums, tambourines, and bells. Each instrument had its own character, its own associations. The harp was considered noble and refined, often played by aristocratic ladies. The bagpipes were associated with peasants and outdoor celebrations. The lute was versatile, used for both courtly love songs and bawdy tavern ballads. Dancing was inseparable from music. When people gathered to celebrate, they danced. Medieval dances ranged from simple circle dances, where everyone held hands and moved together, to more complex partner dances that required skill and practice. One popular dance was the carol, a circle dance where participants would sing while they danced. The leader would sing a verse, and everyone else would join in on the chorus. The dance would continue for hours, with the circle moving faster and faster until people were breathless and dizzy. Another common dance was the estampe, a lively dance with a distinctive rhythm. This was more of a performance dance, often done by skilled dancers while others watched. It involved intricate footwork, jumps, and turns, and it was both athletic and artistic. Dancing was also a form of courtship. Young people would dance together, would hold hands, would move in close proximity in ways that weren't allowed in other contexts. Parents and chaperones would watch carefully, but dancing provided opportunities for flirtation, for connection, for romance. But dancing was also controversial. The church was deeply suspicious of dancing, seeing it as a potential source of sin. Dancing could lead to lustful thoughts, to inappropriate touching, to sexual activity. Some church authorities tried to ban dancing altogether, though these efforts were largely unsuccessful. The church was particularly opposed to dancing in churchyards, a common practice in medieval times. People would gather in the cemetery after church services and dance among the graves. To modern sensibilities, this seems macabre, but medieval people saw it differently. The churchyard was community space, and dancing there was a way of celebrating life in the presence of death. There were also professional dancers, performers who would entertain at feasts and festivals. These dancers were often acrobats as well, performing flips, handstands, and other impressive physical feats. They might dance on their hands, on stilts, or while juggling. Music and dancing were also part of courtly culture. Nobles would host elaborate entertainments featuring musicians and dancers. These performances were highly stylized, following strict rules of etiquette and decorum. They were displays of refinement and culture, ways of demonstrating that the nobility was superior to the common people. Troubadours were particularly important in courtly culture. These were poet-musicians who composed and performed songs about courtly love, chivalry, and noble deeds. Their songs were sophisticated, with complex melodies and clever lyrics. They were the rock stars of the medieval world, admired and imitated. But not all medieval music was refined. There was also a tradition of bawdy songs, drinking songs, and satirical ballads. These songs mocked authority figures, celebrated sexual exploits, and generally thumbed their noses at propriety. They were popular in taverns and at festivals, where people could let loose and enjoy humor that would be scandalous in other contexts. One famous collection of medieval songs is the Carmina Burana, a manuscript of songs written by wandering scholars and clerics. These songs are surprisingly raunchy, celebrating drinking, gambling, and sexual adventures. They remind us that medieval people, even educated ones, enjoyed crude humor and earthy pleasures. Musical instruments were also used for signaling and communication. Church bells rang to mark the hours, to call people to worship, to warn of danger. Horns were used in hunting to coordinate the chase and signal when prey was spotted. Trumpets announced the arrival of important people, adding ceremony and grandeur to their entrances. Music was also believed to have healing properties. Certain melodies were thought to cure illness, to calm troubled minds, to drive away evil spirits. Musicians might be called to play for sick people, using music as a form of medicine. The role of music in medieval life cannot be overstated. It was entertainment, yes, but it was also much more. It was a way of marking time, of creating community, of expressing emotions that couldn't be put into words. It was a connection to the divine, a celebration of life, and a comfort in times of sorrow. Medieval people didn't just listen to music. They made it, they danced to it, they lived with it. It was an integral part of their world, and it was one of the primary ways they had fun, found joy, and connected with each other. Medieval people loved games. They played them in taverns, in village squares, in castle halls. They played for fun, for competition, and for money. And some of these games were so popular, so addictive, that authorities tried repeatedly to ban them, with little success. Dice games were probably the most popular form of gambling in the Middle Ages. Dice were easy to make, easy to carry, and easy to play. You could gamble with dice anywhere, anytime, with anyone. And people did, constantly. The most common dice game was Hazard, a precursor to the modern game of craps. The rules were complex, involving multiple rolls and various betting options. But the basic idea was simple. You bet on the outcome of the dice roll, and if you guessed right, you won money. Dice games were played in taverns, in the streets, in military camps. Soldiers were particularly fond of dice, gambling away their pay, their equipment, even their clothes. There are records of soldiers gambling so recklessly that they ended up naked, having lost everything they owned. The church condemned dice games as sinful, a waste of money and a path to ruin. Preachers would rail against the evils of gambling, warning that dice were the devil's tools. But people kept playing, kept gambling, kept hoping that the next roll would be the one that made them rich. Dice were also associated with cheating. Loaded dice, dice that were weighted to favor certain numbers, were common. Skilled cheaters could manipulate dice rolls, could palm dice, could switch fair dice for loaded ones. Gambling dens were full of tricksters and con artists, and naive players could lose everything to a skilled cheat. Card games were another popular form of entertainment, though cards didn't become common in Europe until the late 14th century. Once they arrived, they quickly became popular, with people playing for money, for fun, and for social interaction. Early playing cards were hand-painted and expensive, luxury items for the wealthy. But as printing techniques improved, cards became cheaper and more widely available. By the 15th century, even peasants could afford a deck of cards. The games played with these cards were diverse. Some were simple gambling games, where you bet on which card would be drawn. Others were more complex, requiring strategy and skill. Many medieval card games have been lost to history, but some, like tarot, have survived in modified forms. Board games were also popular. Chess was the most prestigious, a game associated with nobility and intellectual prowess. Learning to play chess was part of a noble education, and skill at chess was seen as a sign of intelligence and strategic thinking. But chess wasn't just for nobles. Simpler versions of the game were played by common people, using crude boards and pieces carved from wood or bone. Chess sets were valuable possessions, sometimes passed down through generations. Other board games included tables, an early form of backgammon, and Nine Men's Morris, a strategy game played on a grid. These games were played in taverns, in homes, in castle halls. They provided entertainment, mental stimulation, and opportunities for friendly competition. Children had their own games, many of which are still played today. They played hide-and-seek, tag, and various ball games. They played with hoops, rolling them through the streets with sticks. They played with tops, spinning them, and competing to see whose would spin the longest. Medieval children also played with dolls, though these were simple figures made from scraps of cloth or carved from wood. They played house, imitating adult activities, preparing for the roles they would eventually assume. Outdoor games were popular when weather permitted. One common game was stool ball, an early form of cricket or baseball. Players would try to hit a ball with a stick and then run between two stools. It was simple, energetic, and fun. Another popular game was bowls, where players would roll balls toward a target, trying to get as close as possible. This game was played by all social classes, from peasants to kings. It was competitive but also social, a way to spend time with friends while enjoying the outdoors. Archery was both a sport and a military necessity. In England, laws required men to practice archery regularly to ensure they would be ready if called to war. Archery competitions were common, with prizes for the best shots. These competitions were serious business, but they were also entertainment, drawing crowds of spectators. Wrestling was another popular sport. Wrestling matches would be held at fairs and festivals, with competitors grappling in the dirt while crowds cheered. These matches could be brutal, with few rules and injuries common, but they were also tests of strength and skill, and successful wrestlers were admired and respected. Gambling wasn't limited to dice and cards. People would bet on anything: wrestling matches, archery competitions, animal fights, even the weather. Betting was a way of adding excitement to any event, of having a stake in the outcome. But gambling could also be destructive. People would lose their savings, their homes, their livelihoods. Families would be ruined by a father's gambling addiction. The social costs of gambling were high, which is why authorities tried repeatedly to regulate or ban it. Despite these efforts, gambling persisted. It was too popular, too deeply ingrained in medieval culture. People loved the thrill, the risk, the possibility of winning big. And in a world where life was hard and uncertain, where most people had little control over their circumstances, gambling offered a chance, however slim, to change your fate. Games and gambling were essential parts of medieval fun. They provided entertainment, competition, and social interaction. They offered escape from the drudgery of daily life, moments of excitement and possibility. And they remind us that human nature hasn't changed much. We still love games, still love to compete, still love the thrill of taking a risk and hoping for the best. If you think modern sports are violent, you haven't seen anything yet. Medieval sports made football look like a gentle stroll in the park. These were brutal, bloody contests where serious injury was expected and death was not uncommon, and people loved them. Let's start with medieval football, which was nothing like the organized sport we know today. Medieval football was chaos, a massive brawl involving entire villages, with hundreds of participants and almost no rules. The game would typically be played between two villages, with the goal being to get a ball, usually an inflated pig's bladder, from one village to the other. The distance between villages could be several miles, and the entire area in between was the playing field. There were no boundaries, no referees, no time limits. The game would start in the morning and continue until one side scored, or until it got too dark to continue. Players could kick the ball, carry it, throw it, or do whatever else they could think of to advance it toward the goal. But the ball was almost secondary to the violence. Medieval football was really just an excuse for a massive fight. Players would punch, kick, tackle, and wrestle each other. They'd use sticks and clubs. They'd form scrums that looked more like battles than sporting events. Injuries were common and expected. Broken bones, concussions, cuts, and bruises were part of the game. Deaths occurred regularly enough that authorities tried repeatedly to ban the sport. But these bans were largely ignored. People loved medieval football, loved the violence, loved the chaos, loved the opportunity to settle scores and prove their toughness. The game was also an outlet for inter-village rivalries. Villages that competed economically, that had disputes over land or resources, that simply didn't like each other, would use football as a way to fight without it being officially a war. It was violence with plausible deniability. Women sometimes participated in medieval football, though this was controversial. When they did play, the games were just as violent as the men's games. Medieval women were not delicate flowers. They were tough, capable, and willing to fight. Another violent sport was bear baiting, which is exactly as horrible as it sounds. A bear would be chained to a post, and dogs would be set on it. The bear would fight for its life while spectators watched and bet on the outcome. Bear baiting was popular entertainment, drawing large crowds. It was held in special arenas, with seating for spectators and a pit where the action took place. The bears were often starved or tortured beforehand to make them more aggressive, more likely to put on a good show. The dogs used in bear baiting were specially bred for aggression and tenacity. They would attack the bear, biting and tearing, while the bear would swipe at them with its massive paws. Dogs would be killed or maimed, but they'd be replaced with fresh ones. The goal was to see how long the bear could last, how many dogs it could kill before it was overwhelmed. Bull baiting was similar, with bulls instead of bears. The bull would be tied to a stake, and dogs would attack it. Bulls were powerful and dangerous, and they could kill dogs with their horns or by trampling them. But eventually, the dogs would wear the bull down, and it would collapse from exhaustion and blood loss. These blood sports were not just entertainment. They were also believed to improve the quality of meat. People thought that baiting an animal before slaughter made the meat more tender. This belief was widespread, and in some places butchers were required by law to bait bulls before selling the meat. Cockfighting was another popular blood sport. Roosters would be fitted with sharp spurs and placed in a pit to fight each other. The fights would continue until one rooster was dead or too injured to continue. Spectators would bet on the outcome, and successful fighting cocks were valuable animals. Cockfighting was popular across all social classes. Peasants would gather in barns or taverns to watch fights. Nobles would host elaborate cockfighting events in their estates. Even clergy participated, despite the church's official disapproval. Hunting was the most prestigious violent sport, reserved primarily for the nobility. Hunting was not just about killing animals. It was a complex social ritual, a display of wealth and power, and training for war. Medieval hunts were elaborate affairs. A noble would gather his friends, his retainers, and his servants. They'd bring horses, dogs, falcons, and all the equipment needed for a day in the forest. The hunt would be carefully organized, with specific roles for each participant. The most prestigious prey was the stag, a large male deer. Hunting stag required skill, endurance, and courage. The hunt could last all day, with riders chasing the stag through forests and across fields. When the stag was finally cornered, it would be killed with spears or arrows, and the successful hunter would be honored. Boar hunting was even more dangerous. Wild boars were aggressive, powerful animals with sharp tusks. A cornered boar would charge, and it could kill a horse or a man. Boar hunting was a test of bravery, and successful boar hunters were celebrated as heroes. Hawking, hunting with trained birds of prey, was another noble pastime. Hawks and falcons would be trained to hunt small game like rabbits and birds. This required patience, skill, and a deep understanding of the bird's behavior. A well-trained hawk was a valuable possession, and hawking was seen as a refined, elegant form of hunting. But hunting wasn't just for nobles. Peasants hunted too, though they were restricted in what they could hunt and where. Peasants could hunt small game like rabbits and birds, but hunting deer or boar on the Lord's land was poaching, a serious crime that could result in severe punishment. Poaching was common despite the risks. Peasants needed meat, and the forests were full of game. They'd hunt at night, using snares and traps, trying to avoid the Lord's gamekeepers. If caught, they could be fined, imprisoned, or even executed, depending on the severity of the offense and the mood of the Lord. Tournaments were perhaps the most spectacular violent sport of the Middle Ages. These were mock battles where knights would fight each other, demonstrating their skill, courage, and martial prowess. Tournaments were both entertainment and training, preparing knights for real warfare while also providing thrilling spectacles for spectators. Early tournaments were brutal, chaotic melees, where large groups of knights would fight each other with real weapons. These events were essentially small wars, with knights being killed or seriously injured. The goal was to capture opponents and ransom them back to their families, making tournaments potentially profitable for successful knights. Over time, tournaments became more regulated and less deadly. The melee gave way to the joust, where two knights would charge at each other with lances, trying to knock each other off their horses. Jousting was still dangerous, with knights suffering broken bones, concussions, and occasionally death, but it was more controlled than the early melees. Tournaments were major social events, drawing crowds of spectators from all social classes. There would be elaborate ceremonies with knights displaying their heraldry, ladies giving favors to their champions, and heralds announcing each participant. It was pageantry and violence combined, a spectacle that captured the medieval imagination. The violent sports of the Middle Ages reflect a society that was comfortable with violence, that saw it as entertainment, that didn't have our modern squeamishness about blood and death. These sports were brutal, but they were also deeply meaningful, serving social, political, and psychological functions that went far beyond simple entertainment. In a world without books, television, or internet, storytelling was the primary form of entertainment. Medieval people were hungry for stories, for tales of adventure, romance, heroism, and magic. And they had a rich tradition of oral storytelling that kept these tales alive and passed them down through generations. Professional storytellers, called minstrels or bards, traveled from place to place, performing for whoever would pay them. These performers were skilled in the art of oral narrative, able to hold an audience's attention for hours with nothing but their voices and their memories. A good storyteller was worth their weight in gold. They could transform a dull evening into an adventure, could transport listeners to distant lands, could make them laugh, cry, and gasp in wonder. Storytellers were welcome in taverns, in castle halls, in village squares. They were the medieval equivalent of television, radio, and movies, all rolled into one. The stories they told were diverse. There were epic tales of heroes and battles, like the stories of King Arthur and his knights, or the adventures of Roland and Charlemagne. These stories celebrated martial valor, loyalty, and honor. They were long, complex narratives that could take multiple evenings to tell in full. There were also romances, stories of courtly love, of knights undertaking impossible quests to win the favor of beautiful ladies. These stories were popular with noble audiences who saw themselves reflected in the refined, chivalrous characters. But there were also bawdy tales, funny stories full of sexual innuendo and crude humor. These were popular in taverns and at festivals, where people wanted to laugh and be entertained without worrying about propriety. Many of these stories featured clever peasants outwitting stupid nobles or unfaithful wives cuckolding their husbands. They were subversive, mocking authority and celebrating the triumph of wit over power. Fairy tales and folk tales were also part of the storytelling tradition. These were stories about magical creatures, about enchanted forests, about ordinary people who encountered the supernatural. These tales often had moral lessons, teaching listeners about the consequences of greed, pride, or foolishness. Religious stories were another important category. Stories from the Bible, lives of the saints, tales of miracles and divine intervention. These stories were told in church, but they were also told in homes, in taverns, anywhere people gathered. They were both entertainment and religious instruction, teaching Christian values while also providing dramatic narratives. Storytelling was not just a passive experience. Audiences would participate, would react, would sometimes interrupt with questions or comments. A skilled storyteller would adapt their performance to the audience, would emphasize different aspects of the story depending on who was listening. Storytelling was also a communal activity. In the long winter evenings when darkness fell early and there was little work to be done, families and neighbors would gather around the fire. Someone, usually an elder, would tell stories. These were moments of connection, of shared imagination, of passing down cultural knowledge and values. Theater was another form of storytelling, though it was different from modern theater. Medieval theater was primarily religious, with plays performed in churches or in public squares as part of religious festivals. Mystery plays were the most common form of medieval theater. These were dramatizations of biblical stories, performed by members of craft guilds. Each guild would be responsible for a particular scene, and the plays would be performed in sequence, telling the entire story of salvation from creation to the Last Judgment. These plays were elaborate productions, with costumes, props, and special effects. The creation of the world might be represented with painted backdrops and mechanical devices. Hell might be depicted as a giant mouth that opened and closed, swallowing sinners. Angels might descend from above on ropes and pulleys. The performances were both religious instruction and entertainment. They taught biblical stories to a largely illiterate population, but they also provided spectacle, drama, and humor. The plays often included comic elements, with devils portrayed as bumbling fools, and biblical villains as over-the-top villains. Miracle plays were similar, but they focused on the lives of saints and their miracles. These plays were popular because they featured dramatic stories of faith, persecution, and divine intervention. They showed ordinary people that holiness was possible, that God could work through anyone. Morality plays were a later development, emerging in the 15th century. These were allegorical dramas where characters represented abstract concepts like virtue, vice, death, and every man. The plays taught moral lessons, showing the consequences of sin and the rewards of righteousness. These plays were performed by traveling troupes of actors, who would set up in town squares and perform for donations. They were popular entertainment, drawing large crowds and providing both moral instruction and dramatic excitement. But not all medieval theater was religious. There were also secular performances, farces and comedies that mocked authority, celebrated trickery, and featured bawdy humor. These performances were less formal, often improvised, and they pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable. Mummers were performers who would dress in costumes and masks and perform short plays or skits. These performances often took place during festivals, especially Christmas and New Year. Mummers would go from house to house performing in exchange for food, drink, or money. Mumming plays often featured stock characters: a hero, a villain, a fool, a doctor. The plots were simple and repetitive, but the performances were energetic and entertaining. They often included elements of role reversal, with men dressing as women and commoners mocking nobles. Puppet shows were another form of entertainment. Puppeteers would travel with portable stages, performing shows with hand puppets or marionettes. These shows were popular with children, but adults enjoyed them too. The puppets could say and do things that human actors couldn't, allowing for more subversive and satirical content. Storytelling and theater were essential to medieval culture. They preserved history, taught values, provided entertainment, and created shared cultural experiences. In a world where most people couldn't read, where information traveled slowly, where life was often hard and short, stories provided escape, meaning, and connection. The medieval love of stories reminds us that narrative is fundamental to human experience. We need stories to make sense of the world, to understand ourselves, to connect with others. Medieval people understood this, and they created a rich tradition of storytelling that continues to influence us today. If there's one thing medieval people knew how to do, it was feast. When they had the opportunity, when there was food to spare, when there was something to celebrate, medieval people would gather and eat and drink until they could barely move. Feasting was entertainment, social bonding, and conspicuous consumption all rolled into one. For peasants, feasts were rare but treasured occasions. Most of the time, peasants ate simple, monotonous food: bread, porridge, vegetables, occasionally some cheese or eggs. Meat was a luxury, reserved for special occasions. But when there was a feast, when a pig was slaughtered, or a wedding celebrated, peasants would eat like kings. A peasant feast might include roasted meat, pies filled with vegetables and grains, fresh bread, cheese, and plenty of ale. The goal was abundance, eating until you were full, something that didn't happen often in daily life. These feasts were communal affairs, with entire villages gathering to share food and celebrate together. For nobles, feasting was a regular occurrence and a display of wealth and power. A noble lord was expected to host feasts for his household, his vassals, and his guests. These feasts were elaborate affairs with multiple courses, exotic ingredients, and impressive presentations. A noble feast might begin with appetizers, small pastries, fruits, nuts. Then would come the main courses, roasted meats, game birds, fish, elaborate pies. There might be swan, peacock, or even porpoise, all prepared and presented in spectacular ways. The peacock might be roasted and then redressed in its feathers, creating a stunning visual display. Between courses, there might be entertainment, musicians playing, jesters performing, acrobats tumbling. The feast was not just about food. It was a complete sensory experience, designed to impress and overwhelm guests. Spices were used liberally in noble feasts, not just for flavor, but as a display of wealth. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, ginger, and saffron were expensive, imported from distant lands. Using them generously showed that you could afford the best, that you had connections to international trade networks. The presentation of food was also important. Dishes were arranged artfully, with attention to color and form. Some dishes were designed to surprise or amuse, a pie that released live birds when cut open, a roasted pig with an apple in its mouth, a subtlety, an elaborate sugar sculpture depicting a scene from mythology or history. Drinking was as important as eating at medieval feasts. Wine flowed freely at noble feasts, with servants constantly refilling cups. The wine was often spiced or sweetened, creating drinks like hippocras, a mixture of wine, honey, and spices. These drinks were potent, and guests were expected to drink heavily. Toasts were a major part of feasting culture. Guests would stand and raise their cups, offering toasts to the host, to honored guests, to absent friends, to anything and everything. Each toast required everyone to drink, and by the end of a feast, most guests were thoroughly drunk. Table manners existed, but they were different from modern etiquette. People ate with their hands, using knives to cut meat, but no forks. Forks were rare and considered effeminate. You'd eat with your fingers, wiping them on bread or on the tablecloth. Sharing was common. Dishes were placed in the center of the table, and people would reach in and take what they wanted. You might share a cup with your neighbor, drinking from the same vessel. This communal eating reinforced social bonds, creating a sense of shared experience. But feasting also reinforced social hierarchies. At a noble feast, seating was carefully arranged according to rank. The most important guests sat at the high table, elevated above the rest of the hall. The quality and quantity of food you received depended on your status. Important guests got the best cuts of meat, the finest wine. Lesser guests got simpler fare. The host would often personally serve the most honored guests, cutting meat for them and placing it on their trenchers, thick slices of bread that served as plates. This personal service was a sign of respect and favor. Feasts could last for hours, even days. A major celebration, like a wedding or a coronation, might involve multiple days of feasting, with different events and entertainments each day. Guests would eat, drink, sleep, and then wake up and do it all again. The aftermath of a feast was often unpleasant. People would overeat and drink too much, leading to vomiting, hangovers, and general misery. But this was considered part of the experience. You were supposed to indulge, to push yourself to excess. Moderation was for ordinary days. Feasts were for going all out. Food waste at feasts was enormous. Leftovers would be given to servants, to the poor, or to dogs. Nothing was thrown away. but the sheer quantity of food prepared meant that much of it wouldn't be eaten by the guests. This waste was intentional, a demonstration that the host had so much wealth that he could afford to be wasteful. Feasting served important social functions. It created and reinforced social bonds, bringing people together in shared celebration. It demonstrated the host's wealth and generosity, enhancing his reputation and status. It provided entertainment and pleasure, a break from the hardships of daily life. But feasting also had a darker side. The excess, the waste, the emphasis on consumption. All of this stood in stark contrast to the poverty and hunger that most people experienced most of the time. Feasting was a reminder of inequality, of the vast gap between the rich and the poor. The church had mixed feelings about feasting. On one hand, feasts were often held to celebrate religious holidays, and sharing food was seen as an act of charity and community. On the other hand, the excess, the gluttony, the drunkenness, all of these were sins. The church preached moderation, but people largely ignored these teachings when it came to feasting. Feasting was one of the primary ways medieval people had fun, especially for the wealthy. It combined food, drink, entertainment, and social interaction into a single, overwhelming experience. It was excess, celebration, and community all at once. And for a few hours or days, people could forget their troubles, indulge their appetites, and simply enjoy being alive. You might not think of travel as entertainment, but for medieval people, pilgrimages were one of the few opportunities to leave home, see new places, and have adventures. And while pilgrimages were ostensibly religious journeys, they were also social events, opportunities for fun, and sometimes excuses for mischief. Pilgrimage was a central part of medieval religious life. People would travel to holy sites, shrines of saints, places where miracles had occurred. The most prestigious pilgrimage was to Jerusalem, to visit the sites associated with Jesus' life and death. But there were also major pilgrimage sites in Europe: Rome, Santiago de Compostela in Spain, Canterbury in England. The reasons for going on pilgrimage varied. Some people went to fulfill a vow, to thank God for a blessing, or to ask for divine intervention. Others went to seek healing, believing that visiting a saint's shrine could cure illness. Still others went as penance, to atone for sins. But many people went on pilgrimage simply for the experience, for the adventure, for the chance to see the world beyond their village or town. Pilgrimage was one of the few socially acceptable reasons to travel, and people took advantage of it. Preparing for a pilgrimage was a major undertaking. You needed supplies, food, water, clothing, money. You needed to arrange for someone to take care of your home and responsibilities while you were gone. You needed to get permission from your lord or employer. And you needed to be prepared for a journey that could take weeks, months, or even years. Pilgrims would often travel in groups for safety. The roads were dangerous, full of bandits, wild animals, and other hazards. Traveling with others provided protection and companionship. These pilgrim groups would form their own temporary communities, with people from different backgrounds and social classes traveling together. The journey itself was part of the pilgrimage experience. Pilgrims would walk, sometimes covering 20 or 30 miles a day. They'd stay in monasteries, inns, or hospices along the way. They'd meet other pilgrims, share stories, form friendships. The journey was a time out of time, a break from normal life. Pilgrims wore distinctive clothing to identify themselves. They'd carry a staff, wear a broad-brimmed hat, and display badges or tokens from the shrines they'd visited. These badges were like medieval souvenirs, proof that you'd made the journey. Collecting badges from different shrines became a kind of game, a way of showing off how well-traveled you were. The pilgrimage routes themselves became social spaces. There were established paths, with inns and services catering to pilgrims. Guides would offer to lead groups for a fee. Merchants would sell supplies, souvenirs, and fake relics. The pilgrimage industry was big business. But pilgrimages weren't always solemn, pious affairs. They could be rowdy, fun, even scandalous. Pilgrims would drink in taverns, would flirt and form romantic attachments, would get into fights and arguments. The pilgrimage was a break from normal social constraints, and people took advantage of that freedom. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales gives us a vivid picture of medieval pilgrimage culture. Chaucer's pilgrims are a diverse group, from a knight to a miller to a wife of Bath. They tell stories to pass the time, stories that range from pious to bawdy. They drink, they argue, they flirt. The pilgrimage is as much about entertainment and social interaction as it is about religious devotion. Reaching the pilgrimage destination was the climax of the journey. Pilgrims would approach the shrine with reverence, would pray, would make offerings. They might touch or kiss relics, believing that physical contact with holy objects could convey blessings or healing. Some pilgrims reported experiencing miracles at shrines, sudden healings, visions, profound spiritual experiences. Whether these were genuine miracles, psychological phenomena, or simply stories told to enhance the shrine's reputation, they added to the mystique and appeal of pilgrimage. After visiting the shrine, pilgrims would purchase souvenirs, badges, small bottles of holy water, pieces of cloth that had touched relics. These items were treasured, displayed in homes, and sometimes passed down through generations. They were proof of the pilgrimage, tangible connections to the sacred. The return journey was often more relaxed than the outward journey. Pilgrims had fulfilled their vows, had visited the shrine, and now they could enjoy the trip home. They'd stop at taverns, would take detours to see interesting sights, would travel more slowly. Returning home, pilgrims would be welcomed as heroes. They'd tell stories of their journey, would display their badges and souvenirs, would be treated with respect and admiration. Having completed a pilgrimage enhanced your social status, showed that you were pious, adventurous, and capable. But not everyone who set out on pilgrimage completed it. Some died along the way from illness, accident, or violence. Others gave up, turned back, or got distracted and never reached their destination. The pilgrimage was a test of endurance, faith, and determination. Some people made pilgrimage a way of life. Professional pilgrims would travel from shrine to shrine, living off the charity of monasteries and the generosity of other pilgrims. These wanderers were viewed with suspicion, seen as potentially lazy or fraudulent, but they were also admired for their devotion and their willingness to live a life of poverty and travel. Pilgrimage was also a form of tourism. Pilgrims would visit famous sites, would marvel at great cathedrals, would see cities and landscapes they'd never seen before. They'd experience different cultures, taste different foods, hear different languages. For many medieval people, pilgrimage was the only time they'd travel more than a few miles from home. The pilgrimage experience was transformative for many people. It broadened their horizons, challenged their assumptions, and gave them stories to tell for the rest of their lives. It was adventure, devotion, and entertainment all rolled into one. Pilgrimages remind us that medieval people were not static, isolated, or provincial. They traveled. They sought new experiences. They were curious about the world. And they found ways to combine religious obligation with personal enjoyment, turning a spiritual journey into an adventure. Fairs and markets were not just places to buy and sell goods. They were social events, entertainment venues, and opportunities for fun. When a fair came to town, it was a major occasion, drawing people from miles around and transforming the town into a bustling, chaotic carnival. Markets were regular events, held weekly or monthly in most towns. They were primarily commercial, places where farmers would sell their produce, craftsmen would sell their goods, and people would buy what they needed. But markets were also social occasions, opportunities to see friends, hear news, and enjoy the bustle of commerce. Market day was a break from routine. People would dress in their best clothes, would bring their children, would make a day of it. They'd browse the stalls, would haggle with merchants, would sample foods and drinks. The market was a sensory experience. The smell of fresh bread, the sound of vendors calling out their wares, the sight of colorful fabrics and gleaming metalwork. Street performers would work the crowds at markets. Jugglers, acrobats, musicians, and storytellers would perform, hoping for donations. These performers added to the festive atmosphere, turning the market into a show. Fairs were larger and less frequent than markets. They might be held once or twice a year, and they would draw merchants from distant places, bringing exotic goods and new ideas. Fairs were major economic events, but they were also festivals, with entertainment, food, and celebration. The most famous medieval fairs were the Champagne fairs in France, which attracted merchants from across Europe. These fairs lasted for weeks, with different types of goods being sold on different days. They were international marketplaces, where Italian silk merchants met Flemish wool traders, where spices from the east were exchanged for furs from the north. But even smaller, local fairs were exciting events. They offered goods that weren't available in regular markets: fine fabrics, jewelry, books, exotic foods. They also offered entertainment, puppet shows, animal acts, freak shows, and more. Freak shows were popular at medieval fairs. People with unusual physical characteristics, people with disabilities, people from foreign lands, all might be displayed for the curious crowds. This seems cruel by modern standards, and it was. But it was also considered entertainment, and people paid to see these exhibits. Animal acts were also common. Trained bears that would dance, monkeys that would perform tricks, exotic animals like lions or elephants that people had never seen before. These acts drew large crowds and were major attractions. Fairs also featured competitions and contests. There might be wrestling matches, archery competitions, or races. These contests were both entertainment and opportunities for participants to win prizes and gain recognition. Eating and drinking were major parts of the fair experience. Food vendors would sell all kinds of treats: meat pies, roasted nuts, sweet pastries, spiced wine. People would eat as they walked, sampling different foods, indulging in treats they couldn't afford in daily life. Drinking was also common at fairs. Temporary taverns would be set up, selling ale and wine. By the afternoon, many fairgoers would be drunk, adding to the chaotic, festive atmosphere. Fairs were also places of romance and courtship. Young people would attend fairs hoping to meet potential partners. The crowded, festive atmosphere provided opportunities for flirtation, for stolen moments away from parental supervision, for connections that might lead to courtship and marriage. But fairs also had a darker side. They attracted criminals, pickpockets, con artists, thieves. The crowds provided cover for illegal activity, and naive fairgoers could easily be robbed or cheated. Fights were common, especially as the day wore on and people got drunker. Prostitution was also common at fairs. Prostitutes would work the crowds, offering their services to merchants, travelers, and locals. Some fairs had designated areas for prostitution, tacitly acknowledging its presence while trying to contain it. The church was ambivalent about fairs. On one hand, fairs brought people together, facilitated trade, and provided opportunities for charity. On the other hand, they were associated with sin, drunkenness, gambling, sexual immorality. Some church authorities tried to ban fairs or restrict them, but these efforts were largely unsuccessful. Fairs were temporary transformations of space. A field or town square would be filled with stalls, tents, and stages. For a few days or weeks, the normal order was suspended, and the space became a marketplace, a theater, a carnival. Then the fair would end. The merchants would pack up, and the space would return to normal. The memory of the fair would linger, though. People would talk about what they'd seen, what they'd bought, who they'd met. The fair was a highlight of the year, a break from routine, a source of stories and memories. Fairs also served important economic functions. They allowed for the exchange of goods over long distances, facilitated trade, and helped integrate regional economies. But for ordinary people, the economic function was secondary. What mattered was the experience, the excitement, the opportunity to see and do things that weren't possible in daily life. Fairs and markets were essential to medieval social life. They provided entertainment, social interaction, and economic opportunity. They were places where the community came together, where strangers became friends, where the ordinary became extraordinary, if only for a day. Medieval childhood was short. Children were expected to work from a young age, to contribute to the household, to learn the skills they'd need as adults. But they were still children, and they still played. Medieval children found joy, creativity, and fun in a world that often seemed designed to crush those things. Children's toys were simple. There were no plastic action figures, no electronic games, no mass-produced playthings. Children played with whatever they could find or make. Sticks, stones, scraps of cloth, carved wooden figures. Dolls were popular, especially among girls. These were simple figures, made from cloth stuffed with straw or carved from wood. They might have painted faces, simple clothing, and nothing more. But children loved them, gave them names, created elaborate stories and games around them. Boys played with toy weapons, wooden swords, bows made from sticks and string, shields fashioned from scraps of wood. They'd play at being knights, would stage mock battles, would reenact the stories they'd heard from minstrels and storytellers. Both boys and girls played with balls, though these were not the uniform manufactured balls we have today. Medieval balls were made from inflated pig bladders, from leather stuffed with straw, from tightly wound cloth. They were irregular, unpredictable, and all the more fun for it. Children played games that are still recognizable today. They played hide and seek, chasing each other through streets and fields. They played tag, with endless variations and rules. They played hopscotch, drawing grids in the dirt and hopping through them. They played with hoops, rolling them through the streets with sticks, competing to see who could keep their hoop rolling the longest. They played with tops, spinning them and watching them wobble and dance. They played marbles, using small stones or clay balls. Many children's games were miniature versions of adult activities. Girls would play house, imitating their mother's domestic work. They'd pretend to cook, to clean, to care for babies. Boys would play at farming, at hunting, at fighting. These games were both fun and preparation, teaching children the skills and roles they'd need as adults. Children also played in nature. They'd climb trees, would swim in streams and ponds, would explore forests and fields. This outdoor play was unsupervised, with children roaming freely, getting into mischief and occasionally into danger. Seasonal activities provided opportunities for play. In winter, children would slide on ice, would build snow forts, would have snowball fights. In spring, they'd fly kites, would pick flowers, would watch baby animals. In summer, they'd swim, would catch fish and frogs, would lie in the grass and watch clouds. Children's play was often communal. Children would play in groups with siblings, neighbors, and friends. These groups would form their own hierarchies, their own rules, their own cultures. Older children would lead, younger children would follow, and everyone would negotiate their place in the group. But children's play could also be cruel. Bullying existed in medieval times, just as it does today. Stronger children would pick on weaker ones. Children who were different, who had disabilities, who came from poor families, would be teased and excluded. Children also played pranks, some harmless, some not so much. They'd hide things, would play tricks on adults, would get into trouble, and then try to avoid punishment. This mischievous play was a way of testing boundaries, of asserting independence, of having fun at others' expense. Storytelling was an important part of children's play. Children would tell each other stories, would create elaborate fantasies, would act out adventures. These stories were often inspired by the tales they'd heard from adults, but children would add their own twists, their own characters, their own endings. Singing games were also popular. Children would sing while they played, would create rhymes and chants, would use music to coordinate their activities. Many of these songs have survived, passed down through generations, and some are still sung by children today. Children's play was not always approved by adults. Children who played too loudly, who got too dirty, who neglected their chores, would be scolded or punished. But children persisted, finding moments to play whenever they could, creating joy in the midst of a hard life. The church had mixed feelings about children's play. On one hand, play was seen as natural and innocent, a part of childhood that should be allowed. On the other hand, some forms of play were seen as potentially sinful, leading children toward idleness, mischief, or worse. Some church authorities tried to regulate children's play, to ensure it was wholesome and didn't interfere with religious instruction or work. But these efforts were largely ineffective. Children played when and how they wanted, and adults could only do so much to control them. Children's play in the Middle Ages was a mix of creativity, imitation, and mischief. It was shaped by the materials available, by the adult world children were preparing to enter, and by children's own imaginations and desires. It was a source of joy in a world that offered little joy, a space of freedom in a life that offered little freedom. Medieval children remind us that play is fundamental to human development, that children will find ways to play no matter how difficult their circumstances. They created games from nothing, found joy in simple things, and built friendships and memories that lasted a lifetime. While peasants were playing football in muddy fields and drinking in taverns, the nobility had their own forms of entertainment. Courtly entertainment was refined, elaborate, and designed to display wealth, culture, and sophistication. But it was also fun, at least for those who could afford it. Music was central to courtly entertainment. Noble households employed musicians, often entire ensembles, to perform at meals, at dances, at special occasions. These musicians were skilled professionals, trained in complex musical forms, and able to perform the latest compositions. The music performed at court was different from the folk music of the common people. It was more structured, more sophisticated, with complex harmonies and intricate melodies. It was often based on courtly love themes, celebrating the idealized relationships between knights and ladies. Dancing was also a major part of courtly entertainment. Noble dances were formal, choreographed affairs, very different from the spontaneous, energetic dances of peasants. Courtly dances had specific steps, specific patterns, and they required practice and skill. Learning to dance was part of a noble education. Young nobles would be taught the proper steps, the proper posture, the proper etiquette. Dancing was not just entertainment. It was a social skill, a way of demonstrating refinement and grace. Courtly dances were also opportunities for flirtation and courtship. Young nobles would dance together, would hold hands, would move in close proximity in ways that weren't allowed in other contexts. The dance floor was a space where romantic connections could be made, where alliances could be formed. Poetry was another important form of courtly entertainment. Nobles would compose and recite poetry, often on themes of love, honor, and chivalry. These poems were sophisticated, using complex rhyme schemes and elaborate metaphors. Poetry competitions were common at court. Nobles would compete to see who could compose the best poem, the cleverest verse, the most moving tribute. These competitions were both entertainment and displays of intellectual prowess. Troubadours and trouvères, Poet-musicians from southern and northern France, respectively, were particularly important in courtly culture. They composed and performed songs that celebrated courtly love, that told stories of knights and ladies, that explored the complexities of noble life. These poet-musicians were often nobles themselves, or at least educated men who moved in noble circles. Their work was highly regarded, and successful troubadours could gain fame, wealth, and patronage from powerful nobles. Reading was also a form of courtly entertainment, though it was limited to the literate minority. Nobles would read romances, epic poems, religious texts, and philosophical works. Reading aloud was common, with one person reading while others listened. Books were precious objects in the Middle Ages, hand-copied and often beautifully illuminated. Owning a library was a sign of wealth and culture. Nobles would display their books, would lend them to friends, would discuss them at length. Board games were popular at court. Chess was the most prestigious, a game that required strategic thinking and was associated with nobility. Chess sets were often elaborate, with pieces carved from ivory or precious metals. Other board games included tables, an early form of backgammon, and various dice games. These games were played for entertainment, but also for gambling. Nobles would bet on games, sometimes wagering significant sums. Hunting was perhaps the most important form of courtly entertainment. It was not just a sport, but a social ritual, a display of wealth and power, and training for war. Nobles would organize elaborate hunts with dozens of participants, packs of dogs, and all the equipment needed for a day in the forest. The hunt would be carefully orchestrated, with specific roles for each participant. There would be beaters to drive the game, huntsmen to manage the dogs, and nobles to make the kill. The most prestigious prey was the stag, and the successful hunter would be honored. After the hunt, there would be a feast, with the game that had been killed, prepared, and served. The hunt was as much about the social experience, the camaraderie, the shared adventure, as it was about killing animals. Hawking was another noble pastime. Training and hunting with birds of prey required skill, patience, and a deep understanding of the bird's behavior. A well-trained hawk was a valuable possession, and hawking was seen as a refined, elegant form of hunting. Tournaments were the most spectacular form of courtly entertainment. These mock battles allowed knights to demonstrate their martial skills, to compete for honor and prizes, and to impress ladies with their prowess. Tournaments were elaborate social events, with ceremonies, feasts, and entertainments surrounding the actual combat. Ladies would watch from stands, would give favors to their champions, would crown the victors. It was pageantry and violence combined, a spectacle that captured the medieval imagination. Courtly entertainment also included elaborate pageants and masks. These were theatrical performances, often with allegorical themes, where nobles would dress in costumes and act out stories. These performances were both entertainment and displays of wealth and creativity. The court was also a place for intellectual pursuits. Nobles would engage in philosophical discussions, would debate theological questions, would discuss politics and strategy. These conversations were both entertainment and education, ways of sharpening the mind and demonstrating intelligence. Courtly entertainment was designed to reinforce social hierarchies, to display wealth and culture, and to create a sense of refinement that distinguished nobles from commoners. But it was also genuinely enjoyable. Nobles had fun, found pleasure in music, dance, poetry, and games. They created a culture of entertainment that was sophisticated, elaborate, and uniquely their own. The medieval year was structured around seasonal celebrations, festivals that marked the turning of the year and provided regular opportunities for fun, feasting, and community bonding. These celebrations were tied to the agricultural calendar, to religious observances, and to ancient traditions that predated Christianity. Winter was a time of rest and celebration. With the harvest complete and the fields lying fallow, there was less work to be done. This was when many of the year's major festivals took place, providing entertainment and relief during the darkest, coldest months. Christmas, as we've discussed, was a 12-day festival of feasting, drinking, and merrymaking. But there were other winter celebrations as well. New Year's Day was celebrated with gift-giving, feasting, and the making of resolutions. It was a time of renewal, of looking forward to the year ahead. Twelfth Night, the final night of the Christmas season, was particularly festive. This was when the Lord of Misrule's reign would end, often with a final chaotic celebration. There would be games, performances, and the baking of a special cake with a bean hidden inside. Whoever found the bean would be king or queen for the night. Candlemas, celebrated on February 2nd, marked the midpoint of winter. It was a religious festival commemorating the presentation of Jesus at the temple, but it also had folk traditions. Candles would be blessed and lit, symbolizing the return of light as the days began to lengthen. Spring brought its own celebrations. As we've discussed, Mayday was a major festival, celebrating the return of warmth and fertility. But there were other spring festivals as well. Easter was the most important religious festival of the year, celebrating Christ's resurrection. The celebrations included church services, special foods, and various folk traditions. Eggs, symbols of new life, were decorated and given as gifts. There were egg-rolling contests, egg hunts, and games involving eggs. Whitsun, or Pentecost, celebrated 50 days after Easter, was another major spring festival. It commemorated the descent of the Holy Spirit on the apostles, but it also had secular celebrations. There would be fairs, games, and Morris dancing, a traditional English folk dance performed by groups of dancers with bells and sticks. Summer brought Midsummer, the summer solstice, which we've already discussed. But there were other summer celebrations as well. St. John's Eve, the night before Midsummer, was particularly magical. People believed that herbs gathered on this night had special powers, that wishes made would come true, that the future could be divined. Young women would perform divination rituals on St. John's Eve, trying to see visions of their future husbands. They'd pick flowers, would look into mirrors, would perform elaborate ceremonies, all in hopes of glimpsing their romantic futures. Autumn was harvest time, and harvest festivals were major celebrations. These festivals varied by region and by crop, but they all shared certain elements: thanksgiving for the harvest, feasting on the newly gathered food, and relief that the hard work was done. Harvest festivals often included competitions and games. There would be contests to see who could reap the fastest, who could bind the most sheaves, who could thresh the most grain. These contests were both practical and entertaining, getting the work done while also providing fun. The Harvest Supper was the culmination of the Harvest Festival. The entire community would gather to feast on the fruits of their labor. There would be fresh bread, roasted meat, vegetables, and plenty of ale. It was a time of abundance, of celebration, of giving thanks. Michaelmas, celebrated on September 29th, marked the end of the harvest season and the beginning of autumn. It was a time for settling accounts, for paying rents, for preparing for winter, but it was also a time for celebration, with feasts featuring roasted goose, a traditional Michaelmas dish. All Hallows Eve, the night before All Saints' Day on November 1st, was a time when the boundary between the living and the dead was believed to be thin. People would light candles to guide the souls of the dead, would leave out food for them, would perform rituals to protect themselves from malevolent spirits. This was also a time for divination and fortune-telling. Young people would try to see visions of their futures, would perform rituals to learn who they would marry, would tell ghost stories, and frighten each other. All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day, November 1st and 2nd, were religious festivals honoring the saints and praying for the souls of the dead. But they also had folk traditions, with people visiting graves, lighting candles, and sharing memories of those who had passed. These seasonal celebrations structured the medieval year, providing regular breaks from work, opportunities for community bonding, and moments of joy and celebration. They connected people to the rhythms of nature, to the agricultural cycle, and to traditions that stretched back centuries. The celebrations were both religious and secular, both solemn and joyous. They allowed people to express gratitude, to seek divine favor, to connect with their ancestors, and to simply have fun. They were essential to medieval life, providing meaning, structure, and entertainment in a world that was often harsh and unpredictable. Medieval people had a sense of humor, and it was often crude, bawdy, and subversive. They loved jokes about sex, about bodily functions, about authority figures making fools of themselves. This humor was a way of coping with hardship, of expressing frustration, and of finding joy in a difficult world. Bawdy humor was everywhere in medieval culture. It was in the stories told in taverns, in the songs sung at festivals, in the plays performed in town squares. It was crude, explicit, and often shocking by modern standards. Sexual humor was particularly popular. Jokes about adultery, about sexual prowess, about body parts and bodily functions, these were staples of medieval comedy. Nothing was too crude, too explicit, or too offensive. The goal was to make people laugh, and sex was always good for a laugh. Many medieval stories featured clever peasants outwitting stupid nobles, unfaithful wives cuckolding their husbands, or priests and monks behaving in decidedly unchristian ways. These stories were subversive, mocking authority and celebrating the triumph of wit over power. One popular story type was the fabliau, a short comic tale usually involving sexual or scatological humor. Fabliau often featured clever women tricking foolish men, or peasants getting the better of nobles. They were bawdy, irreverent, and hugely popular. These stories served a social function. They allowed people to express resentment toward authority, to mock the powerful, to imagine a world where the usual hierarchies were overturned. They were a safety valve, allowing people to vent frustrations without actually rebelling. Scatological humor was also common. Jokes about farting, about defecation, about bodily functions, these were considered hilarious. Medieval people didn't have our modern squeamishness about bodily functions. They lived in close quarters, with little privacy, and they were comfortable with the realities of the human body. There are medieval manuscripts that include illustrations of people farting, of animals defecating, of monks and nuns in compromising positions. These weren't considered offensive. They were considered funny, a way of bringing humor into even religious texts. Carnival and other festivals provided opportunities for particularly subversive humor. During these times, the normal rules were suspended, and people could mock authority, could engage in role reversal, could say and do things that would be scandalous at other times. Mock sermons were a popular form of carnival entertainment. Someone would dress as a priest and deliver a sermon that was a parody of real sermons, full of sexual innuendo, crude jokes, and mockery of church teachings. These performances were both funny and dangerous, walking a fine line between acceptable humor and blasphemy. Cross-dressing was another common form of carnival humor. Men would dress as women, women as men, and they'd exaggerate gender stereotypes for comic effect. This role reversal was both entertaining and subversive, challenging the rigid gender roles of medieval society. The Feast of Fools was a particularly subversive celebration. Held around New Year's, this festival involved clergy and church officials engaging in outrageous behavior. They'd elect a mock bishop or pope, would perform parodies of religious services, would drink, dance, and generally behave in ways that were completely inappropriate for religious figures. The Feast of Fools was controversial. Some church authorities tolerated it as a harmless release of tension. Others condemned it as blasphemous and tried to suppress it. But it persisted in many places, a testament to the medieval love of subversive humor. Jesters and fools were professional entertainers who specialized in humor. They were employed by nobles to provide entertainment, and they had a unique position in medieval society. Jesters could say things that no one else could mock the powerful, could speak uncomfortable truths, all under the guise of humor. A good jester was clever, quick-witted, and fearless. They'd make jokes at the expense of their employers, would mock visiting dignitaries, would point out hypocrisy and foolishness. They were protected by their role as entertainers, but they also had to be careful not to go too far. Jesters used various forms of humor: wordplay, physical comedy, satire, and absurdity. They'd wear distinctive clothing, often colorful and ridiculous, with bells and a cap with points. They'd carry a mock scepter, a marotte, a stick with a carved head on top. The jester's role was both entertainment and social commentary. They provided laughter, but they also provided perspective, reminding the powerful that they were human, that they could be foolish, that they shouldn't take themselves too seriously. Bawdy humor and subversive comedy were essential parts of medieval culture. They provided entertainment, yes, but they also provided a way of coping with hardship, of expressing frustration, of imagining alternatives to the rigid social order. They were a form of resistance, a way of asserting humanity and dignity in a world that often denied both. Medieval humor reminds us that laughter is a powerful tool, that comedy can challenge authority, that even in the darkest times, people find ways to laugh, to mock, to subvert. It's a testament to the resilience and creativity of medieval people, who found joy and humor even in a world that gave them little reason to laugh. As we reach the end of our journey through medieval entertainment, it's worth reflecting on what all of this tells us about medieval people, about human nature, and about the role of fun in human life. Medieval people had fun. Despite the hardships, despite the poverty, despite the constant threat of disease and death, they found ways to enjoy themselves. They played games, told stories, danced, drank, celebrated, and laughed. They created a rich culture of entertainment that was diverse, creative, and deeply human. The forms of entertainment we've explored, festivals, taverns, music, games, sports, storytelling, feasting, all of these served important functions beyond simple enjoyment. They created community, reinforced social bonds, provided relief from hardship, and allowed for the expression of emotions and desires that were normally suppressed. Medieval entertainment was also deeply tied to the rhythms of life, to the agricultural calendar, to religious observances, to the seasons. It wasn't separate from daily life. It was woven into the fabric of existence, providing structure, meaning, and moments of joy. Many medieval forms of entertainment seem strange or shocking to us today. The violence of medieval sports, the crudeness of medieval humor, the excess of medieval feasting, all of these reflect a culture that was very different from our own. Medieval people had different values, different sensibilities, different ways of understanding the world. But beneath these differences, we can see fundamental human needs and desires. The need for community, for connection, for laughter, the desire to escape, to imagine, to play, the impulse to celebrate, to mark important moments, to create meaning through ritual and tradition. Medieval entertainment also reveals the tensions and contradictions of medieval society. The church's ambivalence about pleasure, the gap between rich and poor, the restrictions on women, the violence that permeated daily life, all of these are reflected in how medieval people entertained themselves. Some forms of medieval entertainment have survived, transformed but recognizable. We still have festivals, though they're different from medieval ones. We still play games, though the games have changed. We still tell stories, though the medium has evolved. We still gather to eat, drink, and celebrate, though the context is different. Other forms of medieval entertainment have disappeared, and probably for good reason. We no longer enjoy watching animals being tortured. We no longer find public executions entertaining. We no longer think it's funny to mock people with disabilities. Our values have changed, and our entertainment has changed with them. Studying medieval entertainment helps us understand the past, but it also helps us understand ourselves. It reminds us that entertainment is not frivolous, that play is essential to human well-being, that joy and laughter are as important as work and duty. It also reminds us that entertainment reflects and shapes culture. The games we play, the stories we tell, the ways we celebrate, all of these reveal our values, our fears, our hopes. They're not just ways of passing time. They're ways of creating meaning, of building community, of expressing who we are. Medieval people created a culture of entertainment that was rich, diverse, and deeply meaningful. They found joy in simple things, created elaborate celebrations from limited resources, and built communities through shared experiences of fun and laughter. They remind us that even in difficult times, even when life is hard, people find ways to play, to celebrate, to enjoy themselves. They remind us that entertainment is not a luxury, but a necessity, not a distraction, but a vital part of human life. The bizarre, violent, bawdy, joyful world of medieval entertainment is part of our heritage. It's a reminder of where we've come from, of how much has changed, and of how much has stayed the same. It's a window into a world that's both alien and familiar, strange and recognizable. So the next time you're at a festival, playing a game, telling a story, or just enjoying time with friends, remember that you're participating in traditions that stretch back centuries. You're part of a long human history of finding joy, creating community, and having fun. Medieval people would recognize what you're doing, even if the forms have changed. They'd understand the impulse to celebrate, to play, to laugh. Because at the end of the day, whether you're a medieval peasant or a modern person, the need for fun, for joy, for entertainment, that's universal. That's what makes us human. Thank you for joining me on this journey through medieval entertainment. I hope you've learned something, been entertained, and maybe even been a little shocked. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. And let me know in the comments what other historical topics you'd like me to explore. Until next time, sleep well, and be glad you live in an age where entertainment doesn't usually involve getting trampled by a mob or watching a bear fight dogs.